Well, thank you, Margaret. What you say, wisdom in Washington? I think it's an oxymoron. I don't know where that one came from. So, but thank you anyway. Great introduction. Yeah, my name is McGrann, and I'm with Minnesota Law Firm Lockridge, Nauen, the office in Washington, D.C., and have the honor of representing a number of the people in this room and other local Minnesota entities that deal with a lot of transportation-related infrastructure investments. So, Margaret said that considering it's an election year, there might be some interest in the results, and after last night, I'd say probably there's a lot of interest from a lot of people on these results. So, we'll get going on this right away. As we went into this race, the U.S. Senate, we'll look at the Senate and the House, because, I mean, obviously that's where when you control the majority, you make things happen. So, going in, the Democrats needed to pick up 5 seats if they were going to gain the majority in the U.S. Senate. And then you see there there was a 50-50 split, which obviously didn't occur. The Democrats, at this point in time, the Democrats have picked up 1 seat. Mark Kirk in Illinois lost to Tammy Duckworth. He was probably one of the most endangered incumbent senators, and so that was not really a huge surprise. And the only other two outstanding Senate seats, one is in Louisiana, and that will have to go to a runoff next month. And then the other one is going to be in a seat in New Hampshire, where Republican Senator Kelly Ayotte is still, that race is too close to call. So that's going to be, we'll see what that happens. Margaret, I think I messed up here. Did I? There we go. Okay. So you see so that was what going into it. There were 46 for Democratic seats, 54 Republican, and they needed 5, and they didn't get it. They had picked up just that 1 seat. Now, with respect to that means the Republicans will control the organizational structure of the Senate and will control the transportation-related committees. So we want to look at those and see what we have. The Commerce Committee in the Senate has jurisdiction over all the safety matters, deals with anything related on highways, bridges, roads, like that. So they always get a piece of any kind of transportation bill. And with the win, Senator John Thune, who was the chairman, will continue as in South Dakota. He will continue as the chairman of that committee, and Bill Nelson from Florida, the Democrat, will be the ranking minority member of that committee. The Senate Banking Committee, the Senate has its jurisdiction split up on transportation issues around 3 committees. The Senate Banking Committee, in this case, deals with all transit and rail transit issues. And so that committee, we see that in this case, Richard Shelby from Alabama, Dick Shelby, who's been the longtime chair of the committee, is term limited, so he will step down, and Mike Crapo from Idaho will take over the chairmanship, and Sherrod Brown, the Democrat from Ohio, will be the ranking member and lead the Democrats in the committee. The Environment and Public Works. Public Works probably has the largest jurisdiction in the Senate over any transportation bill. So they'll do the bulk of the bill is going to come out of that committee. A lot of you followed that. The last bill that came out of the Senate last year, Jim Inhofe from Oklahoma was the chairman, and he and Barbara Boxer, the Democrat, kind of teamed up together to really push that legislation through. Inhofe is term limited, so he's out. Boxer didn't run for re-election, so she's gone. So John Barrasso of Wyoming will be the new chairman of that committee, and Tom Carper from Delaware will be the ranking member. Carper is a former House member from Delaware, was a former governor of Delaware, served on the Amtrak board while he was governor of Delaware. He used to be my roommate, by the way, years and years ago. Actually, he was a great guy. Carper is also very much, both of them are very interested in infrastructure investments and have a long history in it. So they're probably, I can see both of them working pretty well together as they go along. Appropriations Committee, every year in Congress, both the House and the Senate, they have to pay for a lot of the portions of these bills. And so the Appropriations Committee comes in as a major part of that element. So as we sit today, because again, Congress has not done their job or got the bill passed. They're coming back next week to finish up the current year's funding bill for transportation and all the other parts of the U.S. government. Thad Cochran from Mississippi is the chairman. He will return in that capacity. He is a long-time member of that committee and has a long history in leading significant efforts for investment in infrastructure and other areas as well. Barbara Mikulski was the ranking member. She will serve in the short term, and then, but Patty Murray from Washington is expected to take over. Barbara Mikulski retires at the end of this year. The Budget Committee sets the overall framework for these issues, and they meet and do that, and that generally is done early in the year. Mike Enzi of Wyoming is the chairman of that. He has indicated he wants to return and take that over. And there's a question of whether Bernie Sanders, the independent candidate for president, by the way, he is an independent and ran for president, by the way. Sanders is indicated he might switch his committee, so it's a question whether he'll return to that, but if he doesn't, he would be the ranking member. Now we flip to the House. Democrats needed 30 seats to take over control of the House. No one actually thought that they would ever get 30 seats. Maybe in the last week following the tape, the Donald Trump tape, there was some thought that they might come close to that. Going into this year, they anticipated they might pick up anywhere from 10 to 12 seats. Later on, as things went along, they started looking at the expectation of maybe picking up 20 seats. So as we sit here today, I think the current number is 8. So, and there are still a host, there are probably another 8 or 9 that are outstanding. In any case, it won't make any difference with respect to the balance of power and who controls the process in the House. And we would anticipate in that case that we will talk about that later, but Paul Ryan, the Speaker, they come back next week on the House and Senate, both return to Washington next week on Monday, and in the House, at least, it's currently scheduled to vote on their leadership within their caucuses. So the Republicans will vote for their leaders, the Democrats will vote for theirs on Tuesday next week. There was some pressure, if you will, coming from the more conservative members of the Republican caucus to possibly push that off, make it happen later in the year this year. Primarily people that were concerned that Paul Ryan wasn't vigorous enough in supporting the overall Republican ticket and supporting Donald Trump. Now with the numbers that have come through, and certainly with the win, I think that's taken all the fire out of that flame, and that there'll be unlikely to be any challenge to Ryan's leadership in the caucus, certainly in the short term. Now, in the House, the committee structures is much simpler because we have one committee that primarily has almost all the jurisdictions related to transportation, and that's the Transportation Infrastructure Committee, which many of us in this room are real familiar with. Bill Schuster is the chairman of that committee, and he will return. He was reelected handily, he defeated the same candidate in the general election who ran against him in the Republican primary election. He was challenged from essentially by a very, very ultra-conservative Republican, and Schuster in the primary. Schuster won by just about 1%, and his primary opponent then was able, because of the laws in Pennsylvania, to file and run against him again as a Democrat. And he ran, and Schuster beat him handily in that election. So Schuster will return as the chairman. He's very vigorous and very supportive of transportation, as many of you know, and he has a full agenda next year that he is anticipating moving legislation through, and we'll get into where we see that. Pete DeFazio's from Oregon. He's the ranking Democrat, and he will return to Congress, and he will serve in that capacity as well in the 150th Congress. Energy and Commerce gets involved in transportation primarily on the environmental side, so permitting issues, water, all those kinds of things. Those issues come through the Energy and Commerce Committee, and to that extent, that has an influence on what goes on in the transportation world. Fred Upton from Michigan is the current chairman, but again, he is term limited by term limits for committee chairs, so he will step down, and there is a contest there for the Republican leadership on that committee. John Shipkus of Illinois, and Greg Walden of Oregon. Walden is the chairman of what's called the Republican Campaign Committee, so it is essentially the fundraising arm for Republican candidates for the House of Representatives. And when you're the chairman of that, you get the opportunity to give out lots of big checks. So that means there are a lot of people who are members of Congress, who are Republicans, who probably feel pretty fondly about Greg Walden because he just gave them a $20,000 check. So Walden certainly goes into it with certainly that part of it. Shipkus is also, though, been a long time member of that committee. So is it right now the handicapping on it is Walden was, if there were big losses, the expectation is Walden would not have a shot at this. With the numbers that they have and where it is, I suspect that he's still going to be in the race, and we won't know that until later in December when they take the votes in the caucus for chairman's position. Appropriations Committee, Cal Rogers, the Republican from Kentucky, is a longtime chair. He's going to have to step down, and again, because he's term limited. Rodney Philonesa from New Jersey, or Robert Everholt from Alabama. There will be a contest there, although Rodney Philonesa is probably seen by most as being the more likely person to fill out that. Nina Lowe of New York was reelected handily, and she will be the ranking member of the Democratic leader of that. And Budget Committee is, again, we talked, it's the same jurisdiction as you have in the Senate. Sets the overall parameters for the funding for all programs. Tom Price of Georgia is the current chairman of the Republican, and he will return in that capacity next in the 115th Congress. Chris Von Hollen was the Democratic leader or Democratic leader of that committee, and so Van Hollen was just elected to the U.S. Senate from Maryland, so he was obviously not going to be there. So the likely John Yarmouth, who's from Kentucky, from the Lexington area, is likely to become the next ranking member of that committee. Minnesota, I understand that our senior senator is here this morning, Senator Klobuchar. So I'm sure she gave you kind of a brief of some of the things there. Clearly there were some surprises in Minnesota. Tim Walz, we'll just go down, both Senator Klobuchar and Senator Franklin will be back. They both will have enhanced leadership positions by role of their seniority, but they of course will be in the minority. But in the Senate, as I'm sure they would point out to you, the Senate is a special body, and that even in the minority they have a lot of influence over what transpires and what can get done there. In the House, we go down our list. Tim Walz, the 1st District. It was a very tight race. Walz pulled it out, won by less than 1%. I think most prognosticators would think going in, at least the Washington word was, he was safe to sin. There was no race. He was going to win easily. So that was a narrow escape, if you will, in Tim Walz's world. And I suspect Tim would say that himself. Betty McCollum wins in a walk. Keith Ellison, same thing. Colin Peterson. Colin Peterson was not expected to have any kind of a race. His opponent received essentially no real support from Washington, from the National Republican Committee, and yet, again, reflective of the outstate Minnesota turn for Trump, Peterson wins the race, but in a much narrower margin than he had certainly would have anticipated. In the 8th District, Congressman Rick Nauen is returning to Congress, again, with even a narrower margin than the last time when he won with 4,000 votes. This year, he wins with 2,000 votes, which works out to be 0.6%. Also, Nolan and Stuart Mills' opponent have the distinction of having participated in the single most expensive congressional race in the United States. So close pushing up to $20 million in the 8th District, which is almost incomprehensible to think you could spend that much money on, in a congressional race. But yes, they did. They said the 8th District of Minnesota, and I think it's the 7th District in Virginia, Barbara Comstock, an incumbent Republican member, was reelected Again, in a very narrow race. It's a suburban district of Washington, D.C., Northern Virginia, and I think that that race was also right very close to the 8 in terms of the overall total cost. So, extremely expensive races. In the 3rd district, Jason Lewis beat Angie Craig in that seat, replacing Congressman John Klein by a margin. And again, that was another race that a month ago, the brainiacs in Washington would not have put that race on anybody's list. The races in Minnesota that showed up on the National Republican list and the Democratic list were, for the Republicans, it was Eric Paulson in the 3rd district. That was a real concern. It was a 2-time Obama district. So here you're a Republican running in a district that's carried by Barack Obama twice. It would be a race you'd be concerned about. So there was a real concern with respect to making sure he had the resources. He won handily. I think it was over 10% in that race. And in the case of the 2nd district, the expectation there was that even on the Democratic side, that Angie Craig, it was a done deal. It was going to happen. So obviously Jason Lewis didn't hear that message and went out and admitted he will be the new congressman from Minnesota's 2nd district. And of course, again, Tom Emmer wins in a walk. It was a very easy race for him. Just to kind of set the stage now, so where do we stand on the actually subject matter in this? Last night, well, first of all, both candidates, both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, had pretty robust transportation infrastructure plans, programs. Clinton had a very detailed plan that called for roughly $375 billion over 5 years, very, very detailed, all sorts of, interesting infrastructure, banks, and a host of issues, but it was up $375 billion. Donald Trump, on the other hand, had $500 billion in his plan for 5, and actually has a $1 trillion plan over a 10-year span. And it was probably one of the total policy initiatives of the Trump campaign. Transportation probably was one of the most robust, if you will, in terms of providing some details about what that actually means. The Trump plan was very interesting. In fact, last night, it doesn't really matter, does it? The Trump plan. In fact, last night, 3 o'clock in the morning, when Donald Trump gave his victory speech, one subject he talked about was transportation. And said, we're going to go out in the first 100 days, and we're going to invest $500 billion in transportation. And he says, bam, laid it right on the line. 100 days, we're going to do it. I'm going to introduce legislation, we're going to get up there, and we're going to pass it. And it's not going to cost a cent. Not a cent. That's a damn good plan, I tell you. Everybody will be for that. You guys back in Minnesota ought to take up the legislature. Maybe somebody in St. Paul will want to see that plan. I don't. No. In all fairness, the Trump plan actually was borrowed in big part from what we'll call progressive liberal think tanks in Washington, D.C. So it's an idea that's been around, it's been looked at. And the fundamentals of it, without getting into great details, is simple. It's like, okay, so if the federal government, Trump's plan, his $500 billion plan is based off of about just under $200 billion in federal tax credits. So Congress has got to pass a bill, legislation act, the president signs it, and all that stuff, to offer roughly about $200 billion in tax credits. And the guinea on it is then that private entities and locals and others will get together and all those projects that would be eligible to participate in that have to be revenue generating, because you got to pay those off. And the theory is that with that much investment, $500 billion, with that much investment, those initial tax credits will get paid off with the amount of taxes and that is, sales taxes for the materials, taxes, revenue that comes off of income taxes for the people who work on it, et cetera, et cetera. So these are all to be tolled projects. So they have to be projects that are going to generate revenue, roads, bridges, whatever, anybody, airports, anything that can come up with that would generate revenue to pay off that tax credit. That the federal government will not cost the government in the long term anything, because those tax credits are going to generate enough income to pay that off. That's the theory. So we'll see where that one goes. But he's been very adamant about it. 2 weeks before the election, when he was at Trump Tower in Washington, remember that? By the way, if you need hotel rooms, I'm sure they've got some available in Washington for the inaugural. I've got a steal for somewhere around $1,000 a night. I'm sure we can get you in there real easily. So, but he had an announcement there, and that's when they really came out with, just 2 weeks ago, they came out aggressively with respect to actually issued this position paper. And then last night, as I said, at 3 o'clock, he indicated that they would want to try to move this in the first 100 days. So, Chuck Schumer, who's the Democratic leader in the Senate, has said that would be one of the big issues for him as well. And so that is to say, infrastructure investment early in the administration. So we'll see. Trump has certainly put it up on the agenda for us. And we go on. We see Janet Yellen, the head of the Federal Reserve, have called back. The majority of Federal Reserve governors around the country have testified the past 24 months before Congress that fiscal policy, with the economy needs a punch, and that the Federal Reserve can only do so much through its manipulation through using fiscal policy, that it needs something else. And they have said that the one thing that could help move the economy is infrastructure. Investments that are going to pay off over long term. And the bank was a big Clinton issue. The investment bank, the infrastructure banks, was all part of hers. I just want to mention, we're familiar with, that the FAST Act that was passed by Congress last year. The federal bill offered the Tiger discretionary program, the LEAP program, the FAST Act was the freight programs, which were all set up to sort of spur investment and to pilot and to join up with locals in terms of creating more investments in transportation. I'll call out the one of these. So, and in Minnesota, we participated in a number of these, so I won't go into details about it. The one I will call out that's kind of interesting. I don't know if our friends at MnDOT, but it's the LEAP pilot program. This was authorized in the law, and basically, even though it's only 5 programs, basically what this is that Congress, and then as part of the law, these will be funded. The idea is eliminate the state transportation agency from the stream of money. That is, that the Federal Highway Administration is going to deal directly with a local entity to provide funding for infrastructure investments. The theory being that it can streamline the process, you can get the money out quicker, and it will be, in the long term, better for everyone involved. These demo projects are going to be viewed and looked at as part of that scheme, or that idea. I raised the issue with you. There's not a lot of money at this point in time, but these programs, the program was announced in October. The deadline for application, I think, is in the next couple of months. I mention it to you because one of the other aspects of the Trump transportation agenda is trying to looking at ways to streamline the flow of money. So expect that people who have an investment in local transportation interests, you want to be attuned to that and aware that that's something that we may see more of that developing. So in this new program that President-elect Trump speaks of, you may see an interest in more of that type of thing. And so it's just something I think we want to put on your radar screen to be aware of, seeing that might come down with more opportunities in the future. And the freight programs, and we participated in this in Minnesota as well. Fast Lane Grants, another program that came out. 2017, what to expect. This is just sort of a timeline. Congress, that shows you that the elections are November 8th. New members are sworn in on January. The election, November 8th. They come back next week. They elect their committee, their chairs, and select who will be the leaders of their respective bodies in both the House and the Senate. The new members of Congress are sworn in January, And the president is sworn in. President Trump takes office on January 20th, and he's obligated to have a budget before Congress by in the first part of February, which is a very aggressive schedule for a new president, obviously. And we have the FAA authority too. That's one of the legislation pieces that expires in 2017 that has been that will be for both the transportation committees. Risk of not engaging, again, it's obvious that there's a lot of money. President-elect Trump and is laying down the mantra of a 100-day program. It certainly opens up the windows of opportunities for a lot of people, and it should be something that I think we should all be aware of. So, with that, I'll be around to answer any questions later on. I just thank you very much. I know you got a full afternoon here, Margaret, so thank you so much.